Let's take an opportunity now to see how the Enlightenment and the revolutions that were spreading throughout the world really kind of impacted certain places. How did the concepts of absolutism combined with the age of reason as the Enlightenment took shape, how did these two themes kind of interact in creating some newly created governments and some newly created societies? And so of the many revolutions we're going to talk about, let's focus right now on the American Revolution. Looking at some important critical events, let's go back in time to the Navigation Acts of 1651, where the British were restricting colonial trade to be only with Great Britain. This falls in line with the mercantilism philosophy that we said many European nations enacted upon their colonies. They could trade with other Europeans, however, those would come with very high tax penalties. This will equally benefit both Great Britain and the colonies, again, with that mercantilistic attitude. This is important because over time the relationship will restrict American industry. And as the people living in the American colonies continued or increasingly saw themselves as Americans and not necessarily transplanted Europeans, that restricted industry is going to be a sticking point. This is going to be a problem. The French and Indian War, several decades later, and there were some other circumstances of conflict. The 1676, there's a rebellion there amongst colonists dealing with how the British government was handling affairs with Native Americans, and then there will be a disagreement over the rights of the press, freedom of the press in 1735. But going to the French and Indian War, this is where we're going to really see the American Revolution take shape. Fighting in North America had actually begun in 1754, and it becomes a competition between the English and the French over who will control North America. Great debt by Great Britain in winning this war will prompt new policies and taxes on the Americans. They're going to feel like the Americans owe them the money that was used to protect them from French domination. This is going to outrage the Americans. This is the importance. They're uncomfortable with British policies. They had fought hard to win the war, and they felt like they owed the British nothing. This, with growing colonies' profitability, made the British angry. The colonies are starting to really be money makers for the British. And the debt that they are in is going to fall on deaf ears, because these taxes being disputed are going to fall on deaf ears, because if you were living in London, perhaps, you were paying far more in debt than perhaps a colonist halfway across the world in the American colonies. So complaining to the British Parliament probably wasn't going to go very far. An example of one of these policies would be the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act is going to be a revenue-getting tax to help soften that debt burden from the war. And the Americans are going to protest the Stamp Act, and basically any document that was produced, any paper product document that was produced, needed a stamp, and this stamp cost money, of course. The Americans are going to protest by boycotting. That means refusing to buy British goods. And if you'll think about our earlier Navigation Act concept here, that's going to be a big deal. The Americans protesting through boycotting goods is going to be effective, because losing of money by the British is going to be a mind change. They're going to be a game changer. They're going to change their mind here, and they're going to repeal the Stamp Act. Great Britain will return with what is called the Declaratory Act, basically at the same time, and say that they were allowed to set up policies and taxes on the American colonies. Kind of like saying, don't ever do that again, and if I want to, I can tax you later. We're going to take away this tax now, but if I want to later, we can tax you again. Kind of rings a little hollow, doesn't it? The importance is the fact that the Americans stood opposed to this act reflects the change in their identity. Again, they saw themselves as Americans, no longer European subjects. In some cases, many still continue to want to be subjects of the very powerful British crown. The repealing of the act, though, provides dangerous confidence to the Americans, and it sets Great Britain up for future failure. If they give in this time, the next time, what are they going to do? Are they going to be able to draw a line in the sand? Declaration of Independence was produced by the Second Continental Congress in July 1776. A lot of ground to make up between the Stamp Act and this Declaration of Independence. Actions throughout the colonies that were disputed and called tyranny by radical groups such as the Sons of Liberty will drum up support for ejecting the British, but most really wanted to continue a relationship. They saw a great benefit by being a colony of the strongest nation in the world. The tension was definitely increased, however. These build-up of tensions over retaliatory tactics, though, proved to be too much to bear. Taxes on tea and the retaliatory tea tax, or Boston Tea Party, would lead to retaliation, of course, by the British closing down the harbor, what were called the coercive acts by the British, and the Americans refer to them as intolerable. In other words, the rights that are being extinguished here do not fall in line with what they thought should be protected. These are Enlightenment ideals that they're talking about. So the First Continental Congress in 1774 will basically again threaten a boycott and plan to meet again if their demands aren't met. Of course they aren't. They began gathering arms, ready to fight for their rights. Not for independence, but for their rights. The Second Continental Congress will meet in the spring of 1775 with that continued effort to fight for their rights. And the shots of the Revolutionary War have already been fired. Over time, and by January of that year, a document known as Common Sense will be produced by Revolutionary Thomas Paine, basically stating the case for American independence and saying that it's ridiculous to take orders. The resource-rich Americans should not be taking orders from this, I think, pipsqueak little island off the coast of England. Stand up for yourself, basically. The cause for independence will be forwarded and given to a committee. And of course, Thomas Jefferson will be the main writer of that document that is the Declaration of Independence. So the importance is the motives and desired goals of this will now be part of the debate among Americans. What are you trying to get out of this fight for rights? And it eventually becomes independence. Great Britain didn't just give up, but the growing American identity won the day. They were a little bit lucky to win this war, and the war is not the revolution. The revolution is the change of ideas of their relationship and the imposing of democratic ideals. But they didn't want to. They were fearful of a strong centralized government that the British had. Even though the British democracy was in place, constitutional monarchy, they didn't want that. They wanted more freedoms, and they're going to learn that their extreme response, now we're down to the Constitution, the extreme response to govern at this point then comes under what are called the Articles of Confederation. And this is basically an anti-British statement or system of government. The colonies, now called states, were supreme, and any national government was considered to be dangerous. So it avoided all the bad things from British rule. No power to tax, no standing army, no ability to oversee trade. And this proved to be very disastrous. The American colonies, now the American states, couldn't get along with one another. They couldn't coordinate policy internationally. They couldn't protect themselves, and they definitely couldn't get enough money to handle the services that were needed. So by 1787, the disunity of these states needed a solution, and a stronger national government was created through a convened body that was definitely looking out for themselves. These were the power brokers of the colonies. These became, of course, the power holders of the early states, and they wanted to create a national government that could do what they wanted it to do. Thus, ratification or the approval of this document. And what would this document look like when it's actually executed? What's on the paper doesn't necessarily mean what's going to match up in the reality. So the implementation and direction of this new government was another issue. What is the United States going to look like? This plan, of course, provides enough flexibility and authority to endure, because the United States is still governing itself under this U.S. Constitution. Thanks.